Hey everybody, it's Curse, and today I'm going to bless you with my Sorcerer Static Orb build. Obviously it dishes out a ton of deeps as you can see in the Julra video here. It's super tanky thanks to damage dealt to mana affixes. It kites incredibly well because you can't be stunned, and it looks really cool. This is one of the few builds that gets significant benefit from using the unique shield horns of UK Ross. I'll walk you through all of that later on in the video, and I'll also tell you a few different ways you can run the build and try slightly different playstyles. Alright, let's jump into it. Irashaimase. Some of these builds kill Julra so fast I can't do a proper intro. Anyway, what makes this build extra cool is that it's actually a hybrid melee slash spell damage build, even though we're running a wand, which has no melee damage. So I'm going to start with the skills and items, just to highlight some of the intricate synergies within this build before we go into the skill rotation with the dummy. The main source of damage for the build is Static Orb, particularly Static Ground. This is a Static Ground damage over time lightning build, where you cast Static Orb and it leaves a massive pool of death on the ground, like this. And the damage comes from a bunch of really powerful more multipliers within this skill tree. The first one is Mana Charged. It makes it so that you get plus 5% damage per 20 max mana. We have 1200 max mana, and that is about plus 300% more damage. That's 4 times the damage from this node. And it also adds mana cost as a function of your max mana. So plus 20% of your max mana in this case is about plus 240 mana cost added on top of the 25 base mana cost of Static Orb. So that's 265. And then we take the Overcharge Detonation node, and this node is my favorite. For just 1 skill point, you get plus 3% more damage per mana cost. So our 265 mana cost becomes something like plus 800% more damage. That's 9 times the damage. So you get times 4 times 9. It's absolutely insane. And one more thing we want to note here is the combination of these two nodes is phenomenal. They both scale with mana. So if you increase your max mana, if you double it, that's going to double your damage from this node, but also double your damage from this node. That means every time you double your mana, you quadruple your damage. That's exponential growth. There are very few skills in the game that have exponential growth in a certain stat. So having these two nodes makes it so that we can just spec into mana on every single item slot. It makes our itemization easy. Another crazy multiplier is Electrocuting Cascade. Damage per 10% crit multi plus 15%. And so you can see I have 164 extra crit multi. And that's about times 3.4 damage. I don't know if you're keeping track, but between these 3 nodes, we're at about 100 times the damage. Just these 3 nodes. Next, you want to max out Static Armor. Lightning Aegis is an absolutely amazing buff to have. You want to keep it at all times. That's why I have 4 points, just to get that 8-second duration. At least you should have 3 points in this node, because Teleport has a 5.6 second cooldown, and I'll explain why later, but you want to have at least 3 points in here. And finally, you need Storm Burst as well. 30% more damage and 30% extra area. The more useful thing here is the 30% extra area. The downside of exploding after 4 meters doesn't really matter to us, because we're running melee anyway. We're right next to the enemy. We don't care. This critical multiplier node does not work with the Electrocuting Cascade. This node does not work with our build. It only applies to the explosions damage. This node is not really worth it because the second Static Ground has 50% less duration. And so yeah, now we've got this crazy damage Static Orb, but it's very expensive to cast it. So what do? That's why we run Teleport, Mana Tunnel. The first spell you cast after Teleport is free. So you can see Static Orb 417 mana cost, cast Teleport, 0 mana cost. And the damage 2 tip actually is incorrect. The damage from this node Overcharge Detonation works as if the spell costs 417 mana. That's the beauty of this build. Perfect synergy with this node. You get the free spell, but you don't get the downside of 0 mana cost. And I just want to thank EHG for implementing it this way. I hope it's not a bug, because it's a really beautiful synergy, and it would completely wreck this build if this was changed in some way. Next, you want as much cooldown recovery speed as possible, because you don't want 10-second cooldown teleport. And you want stun immunity. This is an amazing node right here. Make sure to take it. Also the stat buff duration for your stun immunity. Get some armor from this node. And I like the extra 5% global cooldown recovery. But honestly, you can do without it because it's 4-point investment. It's a little bit expensive. So your damage cycle is on a 5.6 second cooldown. Let's say that you want to cast Static Orb multiple times in that 5-second window. You can do that. You just have to find a good way to recover your mana, and that's Mana Strike. It's one of the fastest ways to get your mana back in the entire game. And so you want to spec into all the mana gain nodes. So like this one, mana gain don't crit right here. Of course, mana gain plus 80% here. You want to max those out. And then Mana Strike is actually a really good damage source for this build. If you take this node, current mana is converted to base lightning damage. So we're running 1200 mana. That's 180 base lightning damage. That's why even though we're running a wand with 0 melee damage, we actually do significant melee damage for clearing trash mobs. Later on in the video, I'll show you some Temporal Sanctum clips. And you can see I can clear all the snakes easily with 3 or 4 hits max. And the other reason for that is we get free crits, basically. Every single hit is a crit because of this node. And then finally, you have 5 points to play around with. You can either spec into attack speed and a little bit of area, or you can spec into Mana Storm and get more mana arcs. And the reason we want mana arcs is they apply lightning res shred as well as shock. That's another functionality of Mana Strike. 1, it clears trash mobs. 2, gets your mana back. 3, applies ailments, because Static Orb, Static Ground does not really apply ailments very well at all. We cast it once every 5 seconds. We want Enchant Weapon as well to get a bit of attack speed, as well as to apply ailments with the zaps over here. And I have to highlight, these zaps are actually quite amazing defensively as well, because they stun the enemies quite well. They give you a lot of breathing room, especially because we have all these Sorcerer passive skill tree nodes that increase the shock chance, increase the stun chance, and increase the stun duration. So Zap is a great defensive ability. Don't underestimate it. Try it out and you'll see. You just run into a pack of mobs and they're all stunned. It's great. Get the max duration, a little bit of mana cost reduction. And this is the lazy person skill node right here. I like to get it because I'm lazy. And then this one's also pretty good. If you happen to find an extra point, put it in here. Cleansing ailments is great. And finally, Flame Ward. Every single sorcerer runs this one. Get the extra charge, get the less hit damage, get some elemental damage taken reduction. And I like to get a little bit of Mento Aegis, just because we're running a damage dealt to mana build. And also, of course, the extra duration. Now let's run through the items. There are 3, I'll call them semi-core items in this build. They're not exactly core. You can run the build without them and have great success just because you can get great damage even without these items. So the first one is Fractured Crown. This is how we can run a damage dealt to mana before health build. You can see I have 46% there, another 14% in my chest piece. That's 60% damage reduction. And yeah, it goes into mana, but we have great ways to regain our mana in a Mana Strike. It gives you 24% extra mana, so it's great for our mana pool. It's the perfect item for this build. Unfortunately, the spell crit multi on it does not work with Electrocuting Cascade. If you're curious how to farm Fractured Crowns, I posted a video recently about the optimal way to craft and farm these, so check that out if you want. I also shared a video of me crafting 30 of these, and one of them was the one with 1 LP where I got Endurance Threshold socket into it. I was trying to get a 19% damage dealt to mana before health roll into it. That would have been nice, but it's okay. Endurance Threshold is great for this build. So the next semi-core item is Horns of Ykeiros. This is how we max our endurance from 20 to 60 with just one item. And so we're running an endurance / damage dealt to mana build. So multiple damage reduction sources stacked on top of each other. And the other reason why we run Horns of Ykeiros is 50% increased mana cost. That's 50% more damage for our Static Orb. Check it out. Without Horns of Ykeiros, we have 278 mana cost, 544k damage per second. With Horns of Ykeiros, 417 mana cost, and 864 damage per second. Exactly 50%. It is one of the few builds in the game that has a great synergy with this item. And we love to make underappreciated items best in slot for builds, right? And it's also pretty sweet looking. Check that shield out. I also shared a video of me farming this item. I had to kill Eukaros like 100, 200 times just to get this item exactly as I wanted it. So check that video out as well if you haven't seen it already. And the last semi-core item is Stormcarved Testament. This one is just perfect for the build. It's got plus 85 up to 94 mana, spell damage, lightning penetration, shock chance, even the resistances, physical and lightning are great. 6 attunement, that's 12 mana, and it gives you Storm Totem, and your Storm Totems are going to be applying shock. This is the perfect item for the build. I almost got a tier 7 mana into it. That would have been ideal if that prefix was tier 7 mana instead of physical damage. But at least we got the endurance threshold. So again, those are the 3 semi-core items. You can do without them, but some of them make the build a lot better. Some of them make it unique and cool, while at the same time increasing your DPS significantly. Once you have your endurance percentage maxed at 60, you want to get your endurance threshold to 910 and make sure you don't have any health on any of your item slots or any of your passives. You want your health minimal at 910 just so you can cover all of it with your endurance threshold, because any amount not covered by the endurance threshold is going to drain your mana quite a bit every time you take damage. Your endurance threshold is protecting your mana as well as your HP. For weapon, Crystal Wand is best in slot with crit strike multi as well as elemental damage over time. Ideally you want shock chance on your suffixes, but the primary focus is on the prefixes here. You also want a chest piece that adds adaptive spell damage and flat armor. So you'll notice I'm actually running quite high armor, 2500, which is a 43% damage reduction on physical hits. And so we're running a bunch of different damage mitigation sources, making this build incredibly tanky. We even have a little bit of block chance. And if you're running hardcore, yeah, of course, you want Bastion instead of Horns every single time for hardcore, but that item is going to get nerfed. It's just too good. For rings, you want to prioritize endurance threshold and get your elemental damage over time. Those are the best prefixes for this build because they spawn with much higher percentages. So you can see I have endurance threshold in both my rings. Strength is deceptively good for this build because it gives you so much armor. Every single point is 4% armor. And even though strength doesn't give us any damage, just for the armor alone, I think it's worth it. That's how I get up to 2500. You can see I get more armor from my boots, more mana from the base item of the belt. Crusader gauntlets are great. And for my amulet, I happen to have this one with 150 some mana in it, just to max out on the mana. And crit strike multi. It's too bad that 200% of max mana added as stun avoidance isn't really helpful for this build because we're immune to stun anyways. Because we'd run like 1200 mana. It would have been a good synergy right there. Honestly, best in slot for amulet is Orion's Eye with 150 mana roll and socketed with tier 7 mana. Can you imagine that? That would be 267 mana in one amulet. Anyway, I'll keep on dreaming for that one. If anybody happens to get a 267 mana Orion's Eye, you have to screenshot and send it over because that's the dream item for this build. And now here's a really cool weapon alternative. A gate staff. The prefixes are similar as our wand, crit multi and elemental damage over time, but the cool thing here is 50% increased spell mana cost. So that functions the exact same way as Horns of Eukaros. It makes our static orb do 50% more damage. It's great. So check that out. If you remember with Horns, we were dealing about 850k damage ticks. With this one, we go up to 1.5 mil. It's a great damage increase weapon. The only thing to note is you lose all of your endurance. You basically take double damage when you use this gate staff. You don't want to do that too often. You probably noticed I was using it to kill Julra because she doesn't really do much for the first 15 seconds of the fight. That's pretty much enough to kill her. Yeah, this is the YOLO setup. Or if you're running in multiplayer and you can get somebody to increase your survivability, you can run a gate staff with this build. For idols, you want 4 of these grand idols with double mana and armor. And then you want some arcane idols with double lightning damage. You can run Throne of Ambition as well for the armor against bosses, but other than that, it's not too useful. In terms of blessings, crit multi is best in slot here. Lightning res shred is best in slot here. Endurance threshold here. Armor from this timeline. The only timeline where you can switch things up a little bit is this one where you can argue between all res and crit strike avoidance. Let's quickly go through the passives. Unfortunately, you want to avoid this one because it increases our health, but we would love to get extra mana. This one's great for the attack speed and cast speed. On the Spellblade skill tree, you want 15 points to unlock Enchant Weapon. 5 points in Arcane Shooting is good as well for 10% damage reduction. You can choose to invest more into the Spellblade skill tree and go all the way to here, invest 5 points in this one just to get more damage reduction at 4 stacks, as well as some armor. And then also get your 15% attack speed from Essence Duo as well. In the Sorcerer passive skill tree, the ones to mention are every single one that gives you mana. Make sure to max it. This one gives you 1.5% lightning damage leech, and that's all you need. We're running only at 900 HP. Even that tiny 1.5% is more than enough. Make sure to get the stun chance and stun duration, and then everything else is pretty straightforward. Now let's talk about the skill rotation. If the area is easy enough to manage, you just teleport into the enemy and pop your 0 mana static orb. Enchant Weapon is going to cast itself, so you don't need to worry about it. If you happen to need to cast an extra static orb, cast it. It's going to drain your mana, then you can easily regain it very quickly with Mana Strike. You can see it takes a second and a half and you're back to max. The best way to utilize your static orb is to cast it between yourself and the enemy, and then just guide the enemy into your massive circle of death over there. Make sure to keep your mana topped up. If you're running Arena or some really tough Monolith, for example, what you want to do is just cast your teleport, static orb behind you, run away, enemies are going to run into it and die. It's a really good kiting build. You can't be stunned. You have a ton of survivability. I tried running Arena, and honestly, I don't enjoy playing Arena at all. It's way too slow paced. And I got something like wave 310 or 20 on my first try, so you can easily push this to wave 400 and above. And now I'll mention an alternative playstyle for this build. The build scales really well with mana, obviously, but it also scales really well with melee attack speed. Higher melee attack speed gives you more mana so you can cast more static orbs, and also regains your mana so that you can be tanky. It's pretty straightforward, really. In the setup that I have right now, I've opted to play around the 5.6 second teleport cooldown, and I mostly avoid casting static orb and hitting mana strike too much. Obviously I do it every now and then when I'm overwhelmed by mobs, but if you want to play around melee attack speed, you can do that. Switch to a scepter instead, because wands can't spawn with melee attack speed, and go for melee attack speed tier 7 and maybe crit multi tier 5, and also get tier 7 melee attack speed in your gloves. Make sure to get the passive that gives you 15% more attack speed right here, and you can do things like get a 15% attack speed amulet on the base type. So if this playstyle of casting static orb every 5-6 seconds is too slow for you, switch to the melee attack speed playstyle. I've tested it out, it works well. Another crazy idea for this build is to switch from static ground to actually dealing damage with crits. So you take these two nodes out, pump critical trajectory, and get your crit chance as high as possible. I tried to make this work, and I also tried it with one static orb orbiting around me, but it didn't feel as good as I thought it would, unfortunately. You can also add the smaller orbs as well and see if you can make something interesting work. But in my experience, the static ground version is best. For skill progression, I would recommend start with Mana Strike, and whatever damage skill you choose to pair it up with, either Lightning Blast or Elemental Nova early on, just something to get you to static orb around level 25-30. And then as soon as you have teleport, make sure to spec into it and beeline into this node. You want to max this node ASAP. So it takes about 2-1-1-5, so that's 9 points to max that out. For Static Orb, it's an amazing skill early on, so you can really do whatever you want with it, as long as you're going along some of these paths. I'd recommend going this way first, just to give your damage high, nice and high. And you don't need to worry about Enchant Weapon too early on in the game. You can leave that for last, because it requires 15-point investment in the Spellblade tree, so it's going to take you a while to get there. And then in terms of items, try to get your Stormcarved Testament ASAP. It's quite easy to drop off of Lagan. And then Horns of Icarus is not too bad either. Fractured Crown is also fairly easy to craft. Unfortunately, you're going to get a lot of bad rolls, so you're going to have to craft a few of them before you get a good one. But yeah, check out my guide on how to get Fractured Crowns. And that's it. That should get you nice and geared up and ready to push this build to the max. Seriously though, this build is insanely tanky. Check out how we brush off a full blast of Corruption 400 Emperor of Corpses, and that's without activating Flame Ward. Now check out the same blast after we activate Flame Ward. It tickles. And as I was building this video, I noticed that Flame Ward's less damage taken from hits does not protect your mana for some reason. Hopefully it's a bug and it gets fixed. Now take a look at a Corruption 400 Monolith run, just to get a sense of the positioning of your hero versus the enemies. It plays a huge role into this build. This build can definitely push corruption 500-600 as well. Anyway, this is it for the build guide. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed it, like and subscribe. And let's get hyped. 0.9 is just around the corner. 2 weeks to go. Take it easy. Cuci so sama desta.